Hi everyone, this is Anna and welcome to another sewing tutorial. Today I will teach you how to make this coat. Visit my website annathetailer.com for a ready-to-sew pattern in 9 different sizes. For this project I will use wool cashmere fabric. As lining I will use viscose. And also I will need a fusible interfacing to add to main fabric to give it more stability. Add fusing to details as indicated on the pattern. And let's start stitching. Pin back details together. Mark 1 cm down from the vent and 4 cm from vent side. Make marks meet and stitch center back seam. Press seam open and fix the seam in place using tailor's wooden clapper or tailor's pressing ham. Take the welt details. Fold in half from shorter side, pin on each side and stitch. Cut off half of the seams and upper corners. Turn out the details and press them flat. On the front coat details, mark pocket placement as shown on a pattern. Take the needle and thread and make a basting stitch, leaving thread loops on every stitch. Trace the thread all around pocket. Once done, detach details from each other and cut through the stitch following the thread. Mark pocket with chalk, and threads can be removed permanently. Take the welt details and mark 1 cm from the edge. Also mark 1 cm on the pocket placement. Match welt with pocket placement. Pin it and stitch both welts. Take the upper pocket lining. Place it close to the stitch and pin. Make mark few millimeters inside from the welt edge. Draw line close to the welt and make a stitch. Place lower pocket lining. Pin and stitch to the same stitch as welt. Cut in the middle of the 2 stitches and carefully make small triangles at the ends. Push lining inside the opening. Pin welt to the pocket placement. Turn over the detail and pin triangles to the lining. Use one-sided foot to stitch the lining. Hand stitch welt sides with invisible stitch. Place cotton cloth over the welt and press it. Place front detail on top of the back with face side inside. Pin shoulder and side seams and stitch. Press seams open and use the clapper to fix seams in place. Place undersleeve detail on top of the upper sleeve. Pin along the outer seam and then stitch. Press seam open and fix with clapper. On the sleeve bottom, mark 4 cm from the edge. Fold and press with iron. Join inseams. Pin and stitch both sleeves. Press seam open. Make a big stitch on the sleeve head. Take bottom thread and pull to make sleeve head round. Press gathering to make it smooth. Place sleeve inside the armhole. Pin matching notches and stitch both sleeves in. Take the shoulder pads, fold them in half and pin it to the shoulder seams. And then hand stitch the shoulder pads. Take the lower collar and join details together. Pin and stitch. Press seam open. Take collar stand details. Pin each stand to each collar and stitch them in. Make small notches along the seam allowance. And press seams open. Make 2 stitches on each side from the seam, on both collar details. Place upper collar on top of the lower collar with face side inside. Pin all sides except bottom and stitch starting and ending 1 cm further from the edge. Cut off half of the seam allowance as well as corners. Turn out the collar. Fold seam towards lower collar and make a stay stitch, starting and ending as far as you can reach. And press the collar. Pin collar to the neckline, matching seams and notches. And stitch the collar in. Take the belt loop details, fold in half on the longer side, pin and stitch. Trim seam allowance and turn out the loop using loop turner. Press the loops flat. From a pattern, transfer loop marks to the coat side seams. Pin loops to the lower mark facing up and stitch the loops. Carefully cut off excess seam. Turn loop covering the seam and stitch again. Pin another end to the upper mark and stitch. Cut excess seam. Turn loop to cover it and stitch. And press the loops. On the lining back detail, mark 1 cm down from the vent and then make another mark 4 cm from the vent side. Pin center back seam till the mark and stitch. And also make a small stitch on the notches. And then press the center back seam. This excess fabric inside the seam is needed for the movement. I'm stitching my branded tags to the back neckline interfacing, making sure it sits right in the center. Place back interfacing to the back lining, face side to face side. Pin it and stitch. Turn seam allowance towards lining and make a stay stitch on the lining side. And press after stitching. Place lower closure interfacing on top of the upper closure interfacing, as shown. Pin the seams and stitch. Press seams open and use a clapper to fix it in place. Pin front lining details to the closure interfacing with face side inside and stitch both details. Turn seam towards lining and make a stay stitch. Press seams after stitching. Place front lining on top of the back lining with face side inside. Pin shoulder and side seams and then stitch. Press side seams towards back and then press shoulder seams open. Pin sleeve details together and stitch all seams. Press the seams towards back of the sleeve. Pin the sleeves inside the armholes and stitch them in. Place lining on top of the coat with face side inside. Match all seams and notches. Pin it to the upper collar first, then pin it all together. Stitch with collar first, and then stitch closure interfacing, leaving approximately 10 cm till you reach the bottom. Catch the two neckline seam allowances and join them together, hiding collar seams inside. Pin and stitch using one side foot. Trim half of the seam allowance. Carefully make the lapel notch to almost reach the seam. Trim the rest of the seam allowance and also trim those corners. Turn the coat inside out. Turn seam allowance on a lapel facing coat front detail. The rest of the seam turn towards closure interfacing and make a stay stitches to hold seams in place. Start a stitch as far as you can reach and end the stitch few centimeters before the seam. Press all seams after stitching. On the bottom of the coat, mark 4 cm. Fold the seam allowance and press. Mark 4 cm on the left side of the vent. Fold it and press. Continue the line on the vent and make a stitch finishing 1 cm before the edge. Carefully make a notch 45-degree angle close to the stitch. Turn cord to the wrong side and mark angle meeting points. Also mark center of the corner. Draw a line joining those marks together. Pin and stitch starting 1 cm further from the edge. Cut off excess, leaving half a centimeter seam. And also trim excess fabric at the corner. Open the seam and turn out the corner. And then press it flat. On the right hand side of the coat bottom, join lining with the coat hem. Pin it all together and stitch. Fold hem seam allowance, match lining with vent opening. Pin it and stitch all the way. Fold hem seam allowance with closure interfacing. Open the seam and pin. Make a small notch opposite interfacing to open up the seam, and then stitch that small area. Turn out one side of the coat and make a stay stitch on the lining side to secure seam allowance. Turn hem up and secure it with hand stitch. And press the lining to cover the seam. On the other side of the vent, make a 45-degree notch on the lining. Join lining vent till the corner and stitch. Pin the rest of the lining to the top part of the vent and secure it with stitch. Now let's work on the sleeves. Pin lining to the same sleeve seams. Make sure that lining doesn't twist. Pin face side of the lining to the face side of the coat on both sleeves. Turn out the sleeves. Pin lining all around the sleeve and stitch lining to the sleeve. Turn sleeve seam allowance up and hand stitch to secure it in place. Cut out 4 small pieces from lining, approximately 2 by 6 cm. Pin each of them to the lining and coat shoulder seams. Another 2 attach to the bottom of the armhole on the lining and coat. And stitch. Turn out the sleeves and press. Attach lining on the left hand side of the hem. Pin it and stitch from one side, stopping approximately in the middle, and stitch from another side, leaving a small hole to turn out the coat. On the closure side, make a notch opposite the interfacing to open the seam. Fold pre-pressed hem, pin and stitch that small area. Press the seam open. Turn seam allowance up and secure it with hand stitch. Turn out the coat completely and hand stitch the opening. Press the hem with lining covering the seam. Lastly, take belt details, join them together, pin and stitch. Press seam open and use clapper to make it stay in place. Fold belt along the longer side. Pin all the way but leave a small opening to turn out belt later. And then stitch. Cut off excess fabric from angles and turn out the belt. Pin the opening and hand stitch it with invisible stitch. And finally press the belt. And here is the final result. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you were inspired to make this coat, visit my website annadetaylor.com for a PDF sewing pattern. I hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial and learned something new. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel to see more projects. And I will see you in my next one.